Hey there, this is Tom Auger with part 5 of the Waponi-Woo UI tutorial, Advanced Layer Effects Stacks in Photoshop. We're going to just continue. This time we're going to finish off the container by looking at the last effects on the in the list, which is the Bevel and Emboss. And here we're going to finally get to the mystical contour parameter and figure out what that's all about. So this is going to be a big one, so stay tuned and fasten your seatbelt. The Bevel and Emboss here has been repurposed to more of a 3D highlight. So let's take a look at Bevel and Emboss in greater detail, and I'm going to just step away from this particular example and go back to a more simple example so we can get a better overview of how Bevel and Emboss works. Hey, you remember this fantastic graphic that we created, or I created earlier? Let's just fill the background with 50% gray. That was Shift Backspace on the PC, Shift Delete on the Mac. Let's get rid of the drop shadow by dragging it down to the trash, and here we go. We're just left with Bevel and Emboss on this gorgeous shape. Okay, so as you can clearly see, Bevel and Emboss by default is used to make a sort of a beveling type effect, a three-dimensional effect that's going to have an edge to it. In order to create that three-dimensional effect, we have to simulate highlights on one side and shadows on the other side. The size of the emboss is actually how many pixels are going to be affected by the choice of highlight, which is reflected down here. What mode are we using for the highlight, what color are we using for the highlight, and what opacity is that highlight going to have, and by the shadow, which is the same deal over there. And like all of the other things we've seen before, you can totally repurpose those. If you want two highlights instead of a highlight and a shadow, change that to white, and change the shadow mode to screen. And now we got two highlights, if you wanted to. Not suggesting that you do, but the possibility is there. Alright. So that's basically, and then of course he uses the angle, global light, just like the drop shadow and the inner shadows do. Has this cool thing called gloss contour, which we'll look at a little later on. And then we have two other pages that are associated with Bevel and Emboss. Texture is easy to explain. Grab a texture. Yeesh. Probably play with the depth so that you don't have such a dramatic effect. Basically what texture does is it grabs whatever graphic you've chosen, preferably something that's pretty high contrast, and then uses the lighter parts of that to pull that element up, and the darker parts to push it down, and then takes the settings that you've applied in the main Bevel and Emboss to add a highlight and shadow using these values down here to those elements. So it's actually a really cool way of adding texture to your items. Contour is the one that needs to be looked at very, very carefully, because contour is the way that you can take Bevel and Emboss out of the realm of the mundane and turn it into a powerful tool for creative expression. So essentially what the contour tries to do is define the shape of your bevel. In woodworking, a beveled edge is an edge that's not perpendicular to the plane. In other words, it's an edge that either angles its way inward or has a scalloped or a scooped shape or a rounded shape. If you go to any house in North America and you look at the floor, at the walls and the floor, almost all houses have some kind of what's called molding, some wood that sort of sits against the wall and kind of goes over the carpet, and I have no idea what true purpose it serves other than just everyone's got it, and you go and you buy it at Home Depot and it costs you $80 a linear foot or whatever. Anyway, if you look at that, if you just take a look at one of those moldings from the side, you're looking at a beveled edge. It's sometimes a very complicated beveled edge with lots of scallops and scoops and shapes, but that's exactly what you're looking at. The contour is designed to create those effects. So if you ever play with the pull down arrow here on contour, and let's take a look at our shape, you might start to get an inkling of what the contour can do for you. So let's try to, here's a typical kind of crown molding type of effect, or let's do an even more obvious one, this bumpy one. And to get a real good sense, I'm going to increase the size so that we can really see what's happening here. You can see that it kind of, there's ridges now. It goes bumps up and then bumps down and bumps up and bumps down and so forth. And that's because our Bevel and Emboss contour has been set to one that also bumps up and bumps down like that. So by playing with the contour, you're actually playing with the edge. If I were teaching this in person, I'd be showing you how you would be looking at this object on its edge instead of looking at it straight on to get a sense of what that contour would be like. If this were in 3D, we'd be rotating this right around its middle so it was facing us, and we would then see that exact same contour shape along the edge of it. As it is, we're looking at it face on, and so we can only kind of guess at what that contour is based on the application of highlight and shadow. That's what reveals to us what that three-dimensional shape is. But the contour is actually us looking at the object on its side. What does that object look like from a side profile? So to create your typical crown molding, let's clear this by going back to linear. You'd probably do something like this. Turn that into a corner point. And pull this out like that. That's kind of your typical crown molding shape. Sometimes there's even a little more thrown in there for good measure, just to make you weep. Whoa, hey, come back here. Set that to corner. Gives me a bit of a sharper angle. Sometimes you gotta massage these things a bit. See where we're at. And again, it doesn't look like too much right now, but that you can use that. Those of you that live in North America are watching these tutorials, you know what I'm talking about. You've seen this stuff and you're going, yeah, I've seen that. Just look at the floorboards and you'll know what I'm talking about. Now, we can use this contour for more than just creating an interesting profile to our object. We can actually use this to start our emboss further off than the edge of the emboss. And suddenly it becomes a really powerful tool. It doesn't have to be used just for embossing. For example, let's take a look over here at our contour once again. These represent the two kind of extremes, the start and the end of our shape. If we bring them both down to the output of 0%, we get nothing whatsoever. We get no emboss at all. This represents the end point, and this represents the beginning point. And so by having it, this represents the outside and this represents the inside of our shape. So if we want our emboss to actually take its time and actually give us a little bit of an edge before it starts to show its highlight, all we have to do is sort of take this point inward. Anybody's saying, okay, well, so what? Why would I want to do that? That's just sort of spreading the blob. Well, if you combine that and with knowledge that you can independently control highlights and shadows, suppose you don't want the shadow at all. Now what we've done is we've actually used that emboss to create almost like a highlight like you'd see on glass. And then you can further tweak that by controlling your size. And the depth. And of course you can also, we'll turn off the global light, play with angle to really get fine control over the stuff, over where it's positioned. And you can get some really funky effects. That's the first thing that you can do. You can then take it even further if you start messing with gloss contour. So the contour and the gloss contour are often confused, and the only thing I can say to help kind of unconfuse you is that, remember that gloss contour is contained within shading. Contour is its own area and its own element. Contour refers to the contour of the actual bevel itself. The gloss contour represents how the original contour is now applied to the shading of the element. What parts of the contour get the highlights and what parts of the contour get the shadows. To make this clear, let's just bring our shadows back for a minute. Let's take our gloss contour over here and let's flip it. Now you can see that the parts of the image that were previously dark are now light, and the parts of the image that are light are now dark because we've flipped the contour. You can really get creative with the gloss contour by changing the rules of how the highlights and shadows are applied to your document across the entire transparent gamut. Look at that. We've just created this nice little blood droplet in the middle of our page by applying this typical S curve. It's probably your most common. If you're going to deviate from your gloss contour, that's probably the most common one that you're going to do. This little S curve over here. If we took that and let's just maybe remove our, we're going to want to keep that contour in there. We just need to figure out a way to make this thing transparent. We've got ourselves one heck of a really cool blood drop, haven't we? Alright, let's reset the gloss contour here, because that's not going to help us in doing our progress bar, and I think it's time now to come back to the progress bar and figure out how we're using Bevel and Emboss there to create this highlight. Well, I think you can already guess that because the glossiness is being applied inside the shape and not to the edges, we're using the contour to bring the Bevel and Emboss inside. So let's take a look over here. I'm just going to click over here on contour. Sure enough, you see that there's a contour. What I wanted to do was I wanted to keep a highlight. So actually, let's go take a look. Opacity on the shadow has been set to 0, so we're only adding highlights here. So what I wanted to do was keep a little bit of a highlight all the way around the edge, and then have it immediately zero out and give us lots of space, so that would pull that sucker in and then bring it back up in a very steep kind of curve. The steeper the curve, the sharper the gradient. And for highlights on glass and metallic items, specular highlights in other words, you really want to have a nice sharp curve, a nice clean line. So almost vertical line here gives you a very high contrast curve and creates a really nice sharp effect in there. So that's in your contour. Don't touch gloss contour here. We're not going to be playing with metallic effects or anything else like that. So we're just going to keep the standard contour. And then just coming back and looking at the other parameters, we're using the inner bevel style, so we're not going outside the shape, we're staying inside the shape. Technique is smooth because that's going to create the softest type of edge. The chisel hard and chisel soft are great for creating, well, chiseled effects. Here, because we're truly repurposing the Bevel and Emboss, we need the softest effect to give us the most surface to play with. Depth, I've left it at 100%. The direction is up just to make sure that the highlight is on this side and on the other side. And we're using a fairly large size. Whenever you start playing with contour, remember that contour stretches from the edge of the object on the left to the inside of the object on the right. This represents 100%. This does not represent 100% of the size of the object. It represents 100% of the size of your Bevel and Emboss. That's exactly corresponds to the size parameter that we see here. So from left to right in the contour, we've got 13 pixels to play with. If we only had 2 pixels to play with, I don't care how much detail you throw into the contour curve, you're not going to see it. It's going to come out as a mess, pixelated mess. So make sure you've got enough size to be able to play with your contour. Typically, if I know I'm going to start manipulating the contour, I'll jack the size up to maybe 10 pixels or higher. Sometimes you can go as high as 20 or 30 pixels. Start with that big size, and because you can always bring it down after, just so you can get a really clean look at what the contour is doing to your highlights and to your shadows.